Hey everyone, here is a clip from my conversation with Dr. David Moffitt about atonement. If you enjoy it, the full episode is available on the channel. I wanted to put this one out because we get into the conversation about what is atonement, sacrificial atonement in particular here, and how David kind of came across this topic in his study of the Epistle to the Hebrews. So hope you enjoy it, and if you haven't yet, please be sure you're subscribed to the channel so that you get all of the videos that come out.
You have all this language, especially in chapters 9 and 10, of Jesus entering a heavenly tabernacle, entering a heavenly holy of holies, presenting himself as a great high priest, and presenting himself as a sacrifice before God, or offering himself before God. We have issues with this language of sacrifice, which maybe you want to come back to, but the typical way in the modern period of interpreting that language in Hebrews 9 and 10 was to view it largely as a kind of metaphor. And this is to paint with a broad brush. I hope that's clear to everyone. That many scholars would nuance this or disagree with this. But in the main, there was a tendency to read Hebrews as reflecting metaphorically on the crucifixion. So when the author talks about Jesus offering himself to the Father in the heavenly tabernacle as a great high priest, this is probably in the main a way in which the author is referring somehow to either Jesus' death as if it were a sacrifice offered by a high priest on the Day of Atonement, or to Jesus' death as the means by which he transitions immediately spiritually into the heavenly presence of God. And so the cross has sort of on the historical front-facing side is the death of Jesus. But if you could look and see the spiritual reality of his entrance into heaven, the cross is also the moment where he's a high priest offering himself to God. Well, if you put the bodily resurrection into that account as something that is independent of the cross, that happens after the crucifixion, and then equally something that is independent of Jesus entering the heavenly tabernacle, that is, it happens before his ascension, his passing through the heavens, as the author says in 4:14. If you put the resurrection in there in that way, then suddenly it becomes extremely difficult in any kind of coherent and consistent way to view the language in Hebrews 9 and 10 of Jesus entering the heavenly tabernacle and offering himself to God, to view that as just a way of talking about the crucifixion. With the resurrection between the cross and that heavenly service, suddenly it looks like Jesus passing through the heavens and then entering the heavenly tabernacle is something that actually occurs logically, conceptually, and temporally after the crucifixion, and not something that's just a way of explaining the crucifixion. So that's what put me into the topic of atonement and related to that sacrifice, because the more that I argued for resurrection in Hebrews, and I'm actually perfectly happy to stand behind those arguments, the more that I could not make the language of Jesus as high priest offering himself to the Father a way of explaining the cross. It looked like it was actually an additional thing that happens after the resurrection and even indeed after the ascension. That's what took me into atonement.
That's awesome. Yeah, so what I hear you saying is when you started thinking about resurrection and putting that into the language of Hebrews, you notice now that you have a process going on rather than a singular kind of one-off event. So we often think of have been trained really in church and in theological circles to think of the cross as like this one-off event that does the salvific thing. And now all of a sudden you've got this really rich early Christian, Jewish Christian text where atonement is part of this process, resurrection is part of this process. And so now you're thinking about, okay, atonement is this process. And so that led you then to looking at what atonement is in the Jewish text, right? And
that's absolutely right. Let me, well, first of all, I couldn't wrap my mind around this. I could not understand how Jesus could be offering himself to the Father in the heavenly tabernacle, and that could somehow be a sacrificial act. That made no sense to me at all. Precisely because I believed exactly what you just said, that the cross was really the focal point. In fact, you could even push it further and say the cross was the sum total of Jesus self-offering as a sacrifice, and that's where all the work of salvation had to occur, and that the resurrection, insofar as it mattered, was really just a way of God the Father saying that he vindicated Jesus and had actually accepted his sacrifice. So anything happening after the resurrection and even after the ascension made no sense to me. I've had one critic of my work say that the account of sacrifice that focuses on Jesus offering himself in the heavenly tabernacle is confused and nonsensical. And I get it. I totally get it. Like when I first started thinking about this, it made no sense at all. But what it did is it pushed me to go back to Leviticus, because, I had read Leviticus before and had even heard some sermons on Leviticus. And I just remember as I was trying to wrap my head around this thought occurred to me that there's way more that happens in Leviticus when you offer a sacrifice than just killing an animal. And I thought, well, that's a really interesting idea, because it seems to me Hebrews was saying there was more to Jesus' sacrifice than just the crucifixion. So I went back, when I had that little thought, I went back and I read Leviticus straight through in one sitting. And I really just focused on these sacrificial parts of Leviticus. And I just asked one question, which was, what does the death of the animal do in a sacrifice? And that was when the penny dropped for me. Obviously, interpretation is at the heart of this, right? So I'm not trying to suggest that if you just read Leviticus, it will be self-evident. But it struck me that when I looked at places, especially in Leviticus chapters 1 through 7, but then also in chapter 16 with the Day of Atonement text, when I looked at what was going on there, when you offered an animal as a sacrifice, you did have an act of slaughter. But there were a couple of things that shocked me, frankly. For starters, the act of slaughter was not happening on the altar. And that was another thing that I just knew. I knew that you killed animals on the altar. This is the purpose of an altar. And yet when you look at Leviticus, it's actually very clear. No animals are killed on the altar. We could talk about lots of arguments to shore up that claim, but it's clear that you either kill the animal in the courtyard before the altar, or you kill the animal to the north side of the altar, depending on what sacrifice is being offered. But then after you kill the animal, and this was typically half a line of one verse, he shall slaughter. That was it. After that, there were all these things that happened with the blood and with the flesh. And the focal point then was the altar, or altars, because there's more than one in the Jewish, in the tabernacle, in the Pentateuch, and in the temple in Jerusalem. So it suddenly occurred to me that there was a kind of, as you said, process that was involved the slaughter, but was not limited to just killing the animal, and that the process focused on bringing blood and flesh into God's presence by offering it to him at the altar. And that was really where the penny dropped for me, because suddenly it looked like Hebrews was actually working with the very same basic analogous idea of Jesus taking his own blood and flesh, his own body, into the presence of God and offering it to God in the heavenly tabernacle. And that really was, for me, it sort of like, it was shocking. It blew my mind. It was an account of sacrifice that I had never been taught or heard before. But I thought, okay, I might be wrong, but I thought, I'm not making this up. Like Hebrews Hebrews was teaching me to read Leviticus more carefully, and Hebrews was showing me that there were ways of thinking about sacrifice that resonated with Leviticus in ways that some of my Christian theological tradition thought were confused and nonsensical. And I thought, well, this doesn't seem to be coming from my head. It really does seem like Hebrews and Leviticus are pressuring in these ways. So that, again, is the way in which it forced me to rethink sacrifice and what's going on with sacrifice.
Thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you subscribe using the link below and check out some more of our videos.